I'm Indy Nidell.
I'm Per from Sabaton.
And this is Sabaton History. Defeating multiple enemies in under a week might sound impossible, but 50 years ago it was done in 6 days.
And I was only 14 years old when I went to Israel and was first time told the story behind Counter-Strike.
I am well aware that this is a very controversial topic, and whatever I say about it is going to therefore be controversial. My focus today is the military situation, but it is impossible to explain that without at least some context. Although the Arab-Israeli conflict goes way back before Israel declared independence in 1948, since that declaration, the civil war that preceded it, and the first Arab-Israeli war that immediately followed it, religious tensions and border disputes have been the cause of hostilities time and time again. And indeed, those conflicts began the Palestinian refugee crisis that continues to this very day. By 1967, tension was seriously building once again. Under Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's leadership, a pact with Jordan and Iraq was made to politically encircle Israel, and the various Arab military forces were bolstered with weapons and tanks from the Soviet Union. Nasser himself boasted that the destruction of Israel was the aim of his administration, and it was just a matter of time until the Arabs would reclaim the land. Also, he announced that the Straits of Tiran would be closed to Israeli shipping and mobilized the Egyptian army along the Israeli border. Israel had made clear, though, that they considered the closure of the straits to their shipping a casus belli. On June 5th, shortly after 7 a.m., 200 French-made but Israeli-operated Magister, Mystère, Mirage, and Ouragan aircraft crossed the border and flew deep into Egyptian territory. Flying low to escape radar detection, they were the first step in a plan months in the making. Israeli spies had identified Egyptian military airports and knew exactly when the pilots were having breakfast. And Egyptian high command had been careless in its contempt for Israel and its military. There were no concrete hangars, and their Soviet Union-manufactured MiGs, Tupolevs, and Ilyushins were all lined up along the runways as the Israeli planes banked for an attack run. The air sirens rang out just as the bombs fell. In minutes, 286 fighters were destroyed, and special runway buster bombs left craters along the runways. The Egyptian Air Force had basically ceased to exist, and the first of 6 days of war had begun. Camouflaged by the night, Israeli troops had moved to the Egyptian border in 3 columns, planning to strike towards Suez and the Sinai. Egypt thought itself prepared, and the desert passes were reinforced by trenches, pillboxes, barbed wire, and minefields. But the Israelis came by surprise. A mailed fist of tanks and armor would concentrate the attack on the main defensive line, while paratroopers and commandos targeted weak points via helicopters. Chaos swept through the Egyptian headquarters in Cairo. Despite the reports of the destruction of the Egyptian Air Force, though, Nasser welcomed the opening of hostilities. Immediately, he cabled Damascus, Amman, and Baghdad to try and get them to join the war. And he lied to them and told them that Israel had lost hundreds of planes and that the Egyptian counterattack was already underway. In reality, Israeli Centurion and Patton tanks, which outclassed the Egyptian T-34s and Stalins, were advancing in a pincer movement towards the entrenched Egyptians at Katef. Believing Nasser's lies, the Jordanian army went on the offensive. The targets were the Israeli positions at West Jerusalem and beyond. American-made long-range guns shelled the suburbs of Tel Aviv as Jordanian tanks took off, and even Iraqi armor and fighter jets made ready. The new city of Jerusalem was soon a battlefield. 5,000 Jordanian and around 1,000 Palestinian soldiers advanced on the Israeli positions with machine guns, Bren guns, and heavy mortars, and street-by-street fighting began. Everywhere around the ancient city, the Jordanians were on the move, trying to take vital Israeli positions on Mount Scopus. Loudspeakers atop the Dome of the Rock Mosque spurred the Arabs on to unite and take back the land in a holy war. Immediately after refueling and rearming, the IAF, Israeli Air Force, took off towards Jordan, shooting down the Jordanian Hawker Hunter planes and destroying their bases. Jordanian Patton tanks on their way to the battle were caught in the open and likewise destroyed. Then came news from the north. Encouraged by false reports that the victorious Jordanians were already on their way to Tel Aviv, the Syrian artillery opened up from the Golan Heights. Israel could hardly want to fight at three fronts at once, so they did not respond. Toward the afternoon, Syrian commanders grew bold, and Syrian T-34 tanks came down the hills, shelling villages and civilians. The situation was dire, but the attack was disorganized, and the Israelis fought it off, even dropping napalm on Syrian positions. The Israelis launched an attack in the late afternoon to encircle Jerusalem. Just to be clear, at the time, it was not part of Israel. And after vicious hand-to-hand combat, linked up with their enclave on Mount Scopus. At the end of the first day, Israel was advancing in Egypt and gaining momentum on the West Bank against Jordan, while the north was under constant Syrian shell fire but still holding. Winning or losing this war, though, was decided in the respective headquarters. Lying to each other about the situation had given the coalition's high commands a false impression of the war, and although they had strong and numerically superior forces, they were losing their nerve in contrast to the Israelis. Throughout the night, the fighting for Jerusalem continued, and the Israeli forces made good progress on the West Bank, surrounding the Holy City in the progress. As the Israelis advanced towards Ramallah, thousands of Palestinian refugees flooded towards Jordan. King Hussein now feared for his monarchy. By the second day in the Sinai Desert, the burning wrecks of hundreds of tanks and jeeps were strewn about as the Egyptian army was pushed back. They fought well for their positions, but were overwhelmed by the rapidity of the Israeli attack. Gaza was cut off, and Egyptian high command ordered a full retreat from their fortified positions. This was a colossal mistake, as the more mobile Israelis could now tear into the fleeing troops, especially from the air. Nasser's army disintegrated. Promises of help and unity between the Arab forces never really materialized. Instead, leaders resorted to what would be called the big lie. It was not just Israel that was beating them. It could not be. No, it was Anglo-American forces that were helping the Jews. The West had come to their aid and was bombing coalition cities. This big lie swept through the Arab world from Algeria to Iraq, and American embassies were set on fire. In reality, the Americans and Western Europe did nothing because they feared that the Soviet Union might intervene if they did. The Soviets had a huge interest in the Middle East and especially close ties to Syria. Early the morning of the third day, Israeli Sherman tanks blasted the blocked entrances of the old town of Jerusalem, and the infantry entered from three directions. They were fired upon from windows and rooftops, but quickly seized the old Jewish quarters, which had been abandoned for ages. House to house they fought until the Temple Mount was in Israeli hands. This is a place of major religious significance for Muslims, Jews, and Christians alike. The news soon reached Jews all over the world. The goal of a united Jewish Jerusalem seemed finally within their grasp, and the Messianic era would begin. However, the war was not over, though the Israelis were advancing everywhere and they controlled the skies. On the West Bank, they were pushing towards Jericho, Bethlehem, and Hebron, while the Jordanian army was now on the brink of being destroyed. In Egypt, Israeli paratroopers and commandos infiltrated Sharm el-Sheikh and the Gulf of Suez. But besides a few battles with entrenched tanks and some rearguard actions, the Egyptian army isn't putting up much of a fight anymore, kind of abandoned by its leaders, especially Nasser, who isn't seen for days. By the fourth day, the war seemed pretty much over. Israel had successfully secured all of historical Palestine and advanced pretty much unopposed through the Jordan Valley and the West Bank. Much of the remains of the Egyptian army were trapped on the Sinai since Israeli tanks blocked the passes. It is estimated that 10,000 soldiers died that day alone in the desert. Talks of crossing Suez were proposed in Israeli headquarters. Then came a twist of fate. the Israeli Air Force attacked the USS Liberty, an American research ship in international waters that was on its way to observe the situation. 34 people on the ship died and 171 were wounded. Bombing an American ship in international waters with napalm, whether an accident or not, was an act of war and a diplomatic nightmare. Yet, in spite of the danger of also provoking the Soviet Union, the Israelis decided to attack to the north to secure the Syrian border. So, on the fifth day, after vicious napalm airstrikes, a frontal assault on the Golan Heights began. It was one of the bloodiest and most costly attacks of the war, and loads of tanks and half-tracks were knocked out by formidable Syrian defenses. But the Israelis eventually broke into the Syrian trenches. Close combat followed, with high casualties on both sides, and the Syrians held their positions. On the sixth day, though, after being constantly bombed from above, the Syrians broke. But the great powers of the world had had enough. The Soviets threatened military intervention should the Israelis advance on Damascus, and the U.S. conveyed strong dismay about being attacked. The war must stop now. After 6 days of war, 133 hours of combat, a ceasefire was brokered by the UN in Tel Aviv. The military might of 3 nations had been destroyed, and 3 nations had been defeated and embarrassed. Egypt had lost nearly 80% of its military equipment, Hussein nearly his monarchy. It was time for diplomacy to take center stage and find an agreement for the future, right? Well, we know that hasn't happened still to this day. And it is not my place to try and unravel the incredibly complicated and incredibly sensitive situation of the Middle East. The significance of the Six-Day War is immense, though. Israel had shown that it was not only willing and able to defend itself from multiple attackers, but also to go on the offensive and be the attacker. There was a boom in investment in Israel and in tourism, which turned the sluggish Israeli economy around. Jews could now visit some of their holiest sites, which they had not been able to before, though minority Jewish populations in Arab nations faced increased persecution and even expulsion. Politically, there was a peace offer that included the return of much of the captured territory, but even this is controversial, and there are historians that claim Egypt and Syria never even received it. But there was a shift post-war among the Arab nations from simply questioning Israel's legitimacy as a nation to questioning its borders, which is a big change. Though the entire Soviet bloc broke off diplomatic relations with Israel, local resentment against the victors of the war has never faded, and the war greatly aggravated the already extant refugee crisis, which continues to this day with displaced persons in the millions.
Tell us about this trip to Israel when you were younger.
All right, I was 14 years.
Okay.
And my sister was actually living in Israel at this time.
Older
And,
sister, I imagine.
Yeah, I hadn't seen her for a long time, and I wanted to go see her.
Right?
So my parents kind of blackmailed me as well. I had long hair, but they didn't like it at this time. So they said I had to cut me in order to get there.
Oh, side note here. I've actually met Par's parents, and they're really cool. And something
They are
funny,
cool.
we were sitting at dinner, and his mom was telling me, she thought he was going to work with, like, computers or something. And he said, no, I'm going to be a rock star. She said, you're not going to be a rock star. And so I said to his mom, I said, so what do you think about that now? And she said to me, I was wrong, which is really funny. But they were really cool. But I could totally see that, 14 years old stuff.
I went to Israel and we rented a local history guide. The guy was a lot focused actually around more recent history.
Okay.
And he told a lot about the Six-Day War. Many years later, when me and Joachim are sitting and discussing topics, and we have this super aggressive, very fast song, and Joachim is like, what will fit here? And I'm like, that's the Six-Day War.
And it didn't bother you that it was a controversial topic to many and stuff?
It wasn't. I mean, you know it yourself, how things are when you...
When you do history.
Yeah, when you do history.
I mean, we have, of course, as you know, covered plenty of controversial topics. In the war against humanity, World War II, Great War, between two wars, Cuba crisis. I think in everything there's something that's going to raise some hackles, but we try to do it, apolitically and not just historically accurate to the events, but to talk about the motivations and things from both sides. And that, I think, then you shouldn't be able to worry about anything after that.
A lot of the controversy was from people who were referring to the part in the lyrics where we are singing Israelis rule the heaven. I mean, obviously, one of the first steps that was happening in the Six-Day War was that the Israeli Air Force shot down the planes of the opposing forces.
They had mastery of the skies.
Yes, so they were ruling the heavens.
That makes sense. But have you spent time as a band down in Israel?
Yeah, we've been there a couple of times to perform.
Yeah?
And as we came there the first time, there was a local band that were the support band of us. They were called Desert.
What they called Desert.
Yes.
Okay.
And who also sings about historical things.
People are going to look them up now.
Yeah,
it's a good plug.
And they're gonna find a song where our singer Joachim is singing one of the songs.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, so the band Desert, they were taking us out. It was a funny moment when they were like, do you have a music video for this song Counter-Strike? And we're like, no, we don't have. And they said, let's film it now. Like, now.
Okay.
And we were in a car.
And do we have this?
So that was the song Counter-Strike.
And you've been watching Sabaton History.
All right, thanks for watching. And don't forget to subscribe to the Sabaton History channel, check out the Indies other channels, and support us on Patreon because that's what makes this happen.